So I'm here with my colleagues, Dr. Russell Moore and Trillia Newbell, and we're here having a conversation about human dignity and what that means. And Dr. Moore, first I want to ask you, I think a lot of people in the culture talk about human dignity, they may or may not be Christians, but as Christians when we talk about it, what does Christianity bring to this idea of human dignity that may not be found elsewhere?
Well, I think that intuitively everybody knows there's something unique about humanity. I remember several years ago there was a sort of a radical environmentalist activist who was saying that humans are not distinct at all from any of the rest of creation. Humanity is just another biological product. And I remember thinking at the time, and yet you're not directing your appeals and your letters to other forms of life. You're directing it toward human beings because he knows there's something unique about the kind of stewardship that humanity has and the sort of and everything else. And so I think there's intuitively a sense that that's the case, but it's so compromised by the constant pressure to see human beings as either machines or animals or gods. And so either I can transcend what it means to be human, or I'm just another pile of parts that's being driven along by my instincts or my hormones or my whatever. And so I think there is that intuitive sense. What Christians bring is the sense that no, the uniqueness that humanity has is because God designed us that way, and it applies to every part of the human of humanity, not just of people who may have extraordinary power or extraordinary gifts or so forth.
Shirley, you've written quite a bit about identity issues and sort of women struggling with their identity. And what is, when we think about human dignity, we think about the unique way in which God created humans. How does that help, that discussion?
Well, when we're talking about identity with women, there's a long list of different struggles that women have. So it really depends on what struggle you're talking about. But in terms of just human dignity, just knowing our value and worth come from God Himself. And we are found in Christ. And that's where we should find our security, our hope, our trust, and place it in Him. He has given us value. He has given us worth. No man can, and no man can take it away. So I think making sure that we're focusing on the right person is essential for this conversation.
So, Dr. Moore, is this what Jesus is getting at when He's talking to the religious leaders and they're saying, He's saying, love your neighbor as yourself, and they're saying, who is my neighbor?
Yeah.
And He tells the story of the Good Samaritan. In a sense, is Jesus saying that part of being a good neighbor is recognizing the humanity of our neighbors?
Yes, because the temptation that comes to us is to say, well, my neighbor are the people who are on the inside of whatever structure I have in my mind, and then everyone else, they're either my enemies or they're invisible. And so what Jesus does is to get at the conscience of that lawyer in Luke 10 in order to say, well, the Samaritan who's coming, who would not be recognized by you, is the one who is actually being a neighbor to the person who is beaten on the side of the road. And I think Jesus also gets at often what is the motivating factor that keeps people from loving neighbor, and it's often fear. Fear either of if you're walking down the road and you see someone beaten on the side of the road, something bad is happening here and it could happen to me. There's risk to me. But also that fear of, as Jesus talks about later, of being put out of my tribe, of others saying, well, why are you associating with fill in the blank? And I think that's still a problem, and it's a problem for people in almost every situation.
It seems like it would also compel us to action, right? Not that, I think about the religious leaders. They were probably personally opposed to mugging and assault and beatings, right? Yeah. But they passed by because they weren't compelled enough to go help him, right? And so how does this idea, Trillia, of loving our neighbor and this idea of human dignity, how does it compel us to go into the world and maybe speak up or come alongside those who are vulnerable?
I think the great commandment to love God and love your neighbor compels us. Love does no harm to their neighbor. So we want to do good then. And doing good isn't just, it takes action. It takes action to do good. And so these commandments are, I think, essential in our faith. It's it sums up the law. So to obey God, to love our neighbor as ourselves, means to serve our neighbor, to see our neighbor, to volunteer, whatever it is. So I think we're compelled by Christ because, as we started at the beginning of this conversation, we have a new and different motivation. It's not just what society, it's motivated by God, by Jesus Christ himself. And so I think that's one of the things, is just to have a conviction, a biblical conviction that we should love our neighbor as ourselves. And like Dr. Moore just said, to get a greater view of who our neighbor is and not to have this insular view of neighbor. And I also, just to piggyback what he said, we have to fight self-preservation, which in order to love our neighbor, we have to die to ourselves. That's how we're going to take action. We are self-advancing, selfish, self-focused human beings. And so we have to fight that temptation to be about self in order for us to take action for our neighbor.
Dr. Moore, one of the things that you've written about a lot, but the way that in the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King really used this idea of human dignity. And I think specifically when he's on strike with the sanitation workers in Memphis, and they have those sandwich board signs that say, "I am a man." What is he trying to communicate when he's saying that?
I think what Dr. King was trying to do was to speak to consciences, and consciences that would already know all the right things. And so you're able to say, well, of course we ought to treat human beings with dignity and with respect. There are very few people who would say, well, human beings should be treated with indignity and with lack of respect. But to come in and say, okay, these are human beings here. These are your neighbors being treated with indignity and with a lack of respect. To speak to the conscience and to awaken it.
How does Christ's incarnation, how does him coming in the flesh change the way we think about being human?
Well, Hebrews chapter 2, he joins himself to us and becomes like his brothers and sisters in every way except sin.
Right.
And so that means that when you're seeing a fellow human being, whether that person is unborn or elderly or mentally disabled, or you fill in the blank of any possible category that you could have, this is someone who is reflecting the image of Jesus. He is the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. So when you are disrespecting or neglecting that person, you're neglecting a living picture in front of you of Jesus himself.
Trillia, last question I want to ask. We're all parents, and so not only do we need to think about human dignity for our own actions, but how do we raise kids who think about the dignity of their neighbors?
I think essentially we start with Genesis 1 and help teach them, instill in them the Imago Dei, what it means to be made in the image of God. And I think part of it starts with making sure they know that they have value and worth because they are created by a creator God. And so I think that's the first step, is just to help them understand who they are as being created. And then I believe we should celebrate our differences and celebrate people. And so one of the things that we just try to do and instill in our children is that God, he not only created people, but he created us different. And that we're created different, uniquely gifted, different skin tones, just loads of differences, and that we can celebrate those differences and we could acknowledge those differences. And I think that helps us to engage the world and society and to understand our brokenness. So we can't stop at Genesis 1. We got to go to Genesis 3 and understand our sin and how our sin has broken these relationships. So we want to value people, but people aren't always going to value us, or people are going to treat us unkindly. And it could be very well based on the very thing that God created. just because of the color of our skin. And so how do we fight that? And then, of course, and ultimately share the gospel with our kids. Teach them that Jesus died for every tribe, tongue, and nation, that Jesus bore the wrath that we deserve, and that he rose victorious. And that we could look to this gospel to unite us. We're not there, but we keep looking and keep praying that God would bring heaven to earth.
Well, that's a great way to end the segment. Thank you both for this conversation about human dignity.